The ongoing conflict between Israel and its Arab neighbours has resulted in the most extensive conventional warfare since World War II. Most of the emphasis has been on the land and air aspects of the fighting, but there have also been important clashes at sea. By far the most significant action was the Battle of Latakia, fought on the night of October 6-7, 1973. This small action was the first naval battle in which the exchange of self-guiding anti-ship missiles was the decisive factor, setting a trend for modern naval warfare that continues to this very day. In the first two Arab-Israeli wars, none of the combatants had many ships and there was only minor skirmishing at sea. After the Anglo-French intervention in the 1956 war, however, Egypt decided to build up its navy. One of the chief components of the new Egyptian fleet was a then new Soviet concept called a rocket cutter. This was basically a motor torpedo boat whose main torpedo armament had been replaced by new, guided anti-ship missiles. This technology was very new at the time, and the main problem was successfully guiding the missiles to any great distance, particularly beyond the radar capabilities of the launching platform. The principal missile used by the Egyptians was the Soviet P-15 Termit, NATO reporting name Styx. A particularly large weapon system with a 450 kg warhead, Styx missiles travelled at just under the speed of sound to a range of about 25 nautical miles. Egypt purchased 2 platforms for this missile. The small Coma-class rocket cutter was a 65-ton wooden-hulled torpedo boat built in vast numbers by the USSR in the 1950s. Over 100 were modified to carry 2 Styx missiles instead of torpedoes, and they were widely exported to Soviet satellites and client states. They were effective weapon systems, but judged to be insufficiently seaworthy owing to their small size, so the larger Ossa rocket cutter of a 175 tons displacement was developed. This was, and remains, the most numerous missile boat class of all time, over 400 being built. They could carry 4 Styx missiles and had improved anti-aircraft armament, dual 30mm cannon that were the world's first effective close-in weapon system. Israel was far from ignorant about these activities and realised that its own modest fleet of ex-British World War II frigates and corvettes was becoming obsolete. Acquiring missile boats for themselves became a priority. However, knowing the need was easier than achieving the end. The Arab League was bearing down hard with regard to imposing sanctions on Israel, and the German contractors for the new Israeli boats were pressured into backing out of the contract. Undeterred, the Israelis approached the French firm of Constructions Mécaniques de Normandy at Cherbourg, and these began work on a series of 6 boats according to the German design, to be called the Saar class. Acquiring anti-ship missiles proved impossible, so Israel developed its own. The Gabriel II is a cruciform missile fired from a box launcher. It had a much smaller warhead than the Styx, was much slower and also had less range. However, it did have an unusually low flight path. This sea skimming capability is important because it reduces the range at which the missile can be spotted by hostile radar, and also makes it far more difficult to detect too, as it might be partially hidden by background radar noise. Coming into service in 1965, the initial armament of what was called the SAR-1 was torpedoes, replaced with Gabriel missiles as they became available to produce the SAR-2. The design was long and sleek, diesel-powered to achieve a high speed of 42 knots. Armament consisted of 40mm Oerlikon cannon and up to 8 Gabriel missiles. A second class of 6, the SAR-3, replaced the Oerlikons and 2 of the Gabriels with a single example of the excellent Italian 76mm Ottomalera dual-purpose gun. The next major clash between Israel and its neighbours was the so-called Six-Day War in 1967. As the name suggests, it was a bit of a walkover. Israeli air and land forces decimated their opposite numbers and forced a humiliating peace. However, at sea the new Egyptian rocket cutters proved to be formidable opponents. The Israelis realised that if the war had lasted longer, or the missile boats had been used more aggressively, they would have been in trouble. This was to be brought home more forcefully in the immediate post-war period, when Egyptian Komar-class rocket cutters sank the Israeli destroyer Eilat in the Red Sea. In response, Israel stepped up the modernising of its own navy, and particularly the development of the Gabriel. The Israelis also developed countermeasures. The capabilities of the rocket cutters were examined thoroughly, and a possible defence against them formalised into a new tactical concept. The idea was to close on the enemy boats as quickly as possible, fend off their anti-ship missiles by a combination of gunfire, wild manoeuvring and sophisticated electronic jamming, and then deliver a counter-strike at short range. It looked good on paper, but the technology was as yet untested in battle, and the Israeli Navy was still heavily outnumbered. Pre-war Israeli naval strategy was mostly concerned with the defence of the important port of Haifa. In the event of war, they planned an immediate offensive sweep to preempt any attack. The idea was to lure Syrian rocket cutters out into the open where they could be destroyed. The Syrians were chosen for 3 reasons. At the time, they were by far the most virulent of Israel's enemies. Secondly, their bases were much closer. And finally, they had a much smaller navy than the Egyptians. Consequently, when Syrian and Egyptian forces launched the combined attack that started the Yom Kippur War on October 6, 1973, the Israelis had a raid force at sea as soon as darkness fell. In fact, far from taking any kind of preemptive offensive, the Syrian navy had decided to simply patrol its own coasts. Like the Israelis, they had never placed much emphasis on a navy. Their entire force in 1973 consisted of 2 ex-Russian Petir-class frigates, 3 Ossa and 6 Komar-class rocket cutters, 3 minesweepers, and 8 obsolete motor torpedo boats. On the night of the raid, weather conditions were moderate and had no effect on the action. The battle was fought at night, but because modern ships are watched on radar screens rather than with the eyeball Mark I, this did not have much of an effect. The Israeli raid force consisted of 5 SAR-class missile boats, 3 of the SAR-2 and 2 of the slightly improved SAR-3. They were deployed in 2 columns running parallel to the coast, the port column further out to sea having 3 of the 5 boats. Their radar was mostly set to passive detection mode, making only the occasional active radar sweeps. One of the paradoxes of modern naval warfare is that radar may be extremely good at detecting targets, but is infrequently used because the pulses can be picked up far beyond their own detection range. At around 22:30, just after they had begun to swing starboard towards the main Syrian naval base at Latakia, the Israelis detected a single ship to the north. Unsure as to its identity, they fired the traditional shot across the bow from their 76mm guns. The contact was in fact K-123, a patrolling Syrian torpedo boat. She responded to this challenge by making a run for it, but she also made the mistake of shooting at the Israeli boats, thus confirming she was hostile. The shots from her 25mm cannon fell wide. The Israeli boat Hanit was ordered out of line to engage the fleeing Syrian boat and quickly sank her with a hail of 76mm gunfire. The question now was whether the surprise had been lost. The Israeli force increased speed and continued towards the coast. A few minutes later, they detected another contact 15 miles to the northeast. It was extreme range for a Gabriel missile, but one Israeli boat tried a shot. The target turned out to be the Hittin, an old Syrian minesweeper of about 550 tons displacement. She ran for the shore, and the Gabriel ran out of fuel and missed. The Israelis gave chase, and when the range had dropped to 10 miles, the missile boat Reshef fired 3 more Gabriels. This time there was no mistake. At least 2 of the missiles ploughed straight into the hapless Hittin and sank her very quickly. Neither of these unfortunate pickets, isolated and poorly armed, had the slightest chance against the Israeli force, but at least one had been able to sound the alarm. A few minutes later, Israeli electronic surveillance equipment picked up the radar emissions of approaching rocket cutters at a range of about 25 miles. The Syrians were bringing up their heavy metal. The true trial of strength was about to begin. There is some dispute as to the actual size and composition of the Syrian force, but it most probably consisted of 2 Ossa and 2 Komar-class boats. They also were advancing with their radar set to passive mode, making occasional active sweeps at random times. They detected the Israeli force almost simultaneously. In accordance with their new tactics, the Israelis quickly turned to intercept. At about 21 miles, the Syrians launched a salvo of 6 missiles at their approaching enemies. 6 missiles use an active radar homing system, whereby the missile homes onto their target by means of a small radar system built into the nose. By using electronic jamming, the Israelis were able to confuse these inbuilt guidance systems. Chaff, strips of metal that reflect radar pulses, was also used. All 6 Styx missiles either flew harmlessly overhead or dove into the sea. 8 minutes later, the Syrians fired another salvo of 6 missiles. Again, the Israeli-developed jamming equipment worked to deflect the approaching missiles, though at least one was destroyed by gunfire. 2 Ossas and 2 Komars can only carry a total of 12 missiles. The Syrians had shot their bolt. 10 minutes later, the Israelis were in range to counterattack and unleashed a volley of at least 5 and possibly more Gabriels. Without the sophisticated electronic defences of the Israelis, the Syrians were sitting ducks. The warhead of a Gabriel missile is much smaller than that of a Styx, but more than sufficient to devastate a small rocket cutter. 1 Ossa and 1 Koma was sunk outright. A second Koma was badly damaged and drifted into the shallows, where it was finished off by gunfire. The remaining Ossa managed to escape. It is possible that it was still in port and firing its missiles from there. Triumphant, the Israeli force disengaged and returned to Haifa. The engagement had lasted about 2 hours. Long the Cinderella service of the Israeli Defence Forces, the Israeli Navy established itself at the Battle of Latakia. The Syrians were effectively confined to their home ports for the duration. Later clashes against the Egyptians were similarly one-sided. All told, during the course of the Yom Kippur War, the Israeli Navy sank 8 Arab missile boats without a single loss. Over 70 Styx missiles were either destroyed or evaded. Most battles in history are indecisive, at least militarily. Only a few decide the outcome of a war or result in a shift in the balance of world power. Even rarer are those select few battles that change the very nature of warfare itself, and Latakia is an example of one of these. It was only a small skirmish by the standards of the world's great naval battles. However, it signalled a new way of fighting at sea. Not only had the guided anti-ship missile been proven, the techniques to defend against this new weapon had also been demonstrated. The world's navies scrambled to incorporate both more fully into their orders of battle. Anti-ship missiles became the acknowledged premier weapon at sea, a position they retain to this very day. Nearly 50 years after the Battle of Latakia, the anti-ship missile and defence against it is still the main preoccupation of the world's navies.